Hi, friend. Welcome to this episode of the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, and I am so glad that you are tuning in and taking a listen to the show today. In this episode, you're going to hear a replay from one of my favorite conversations that we have had on the show over the past 5 years. In choosing this episode, I was sure to choose one that I felt personally challenged by and that I believe will inspire and encourage you in your leadership journey. Now, it's possible you heard this episode when it first came out, but that might have been a couple years ago, and you might still benefit from taking a second listen. Or perhaps you're brand new to the show. This is the first time you're listening, and I invite you to just go ahead, tune into this episode, and then go back and find others that you feel might resonate with you and where you're at right now. Now, I want to invite you to connect with me outside of the show. If you enjoyed this conversation today and you want to connect, head over to Instagram. That's where I spend most of my time in terms of social media currently. And you can send me a DM. My username is Esther D. Littlefield. Just send me a DM. Introduce yourself. Let me know you listen to the show, and I would love to connect with you. All right, friend, let's dive in to our conversation today.
Welcome to the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast, where we hope to inspire you to embrace your God-given gifts, skills, and passions in order to lead with confidence. We want you to remember that you are fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God, and you are fully loved by Him.
You have been designed on purpose by God with unique gifts and passions in order to love and lead those around you. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, a pastor's wife, business owner, mom, and writer.
And I'm Esther's co-host, Holly Kane. I'm a wife, mom, and business owner. I also write at hollykane.org, where I focus on my passion for women's ministry.
Together, we chat about important issues that Christian women leaders face. In addition, we interview other women just like you who lead in various roles, from church to community to business. Through this podcast, we offer you encouragement, tools, and resources to help you on your leadership journey. We are so glad you're here with us. Hi, friend. Thank you for joining me today for our third episode in our faith series. Today, Holly and I are joined by Kadi Cole to talk all about developing female leaders, particularly in the church and ministry world. This is a must-listen conversation. Before we get started, I want to say just a couple things. One, today's episode is a bit longer, but I promise it's worth it to listen and stick around for the whole conversation. Kadi brings such incredible insights into the conversation around leadership as women, and she does so in a way that doesn't divide, but rather that supports varying theological viewpoints. So that brings me to my second point, which is that I know this issue is a hot button one, and some of us, we might land in different places in terms of our views on women in leadership, particularly in the church. And I hope by hearing this conversation, you will recognize that those differences are okay and that we can all do things to build women up in our churches and our ministries. So let me tell you a little bit about Kadi before we jump into the conversation. Kadi Cole has spent the last 25 years studying leadership and organizational development, most recently serving as an executive director at one of America's largest and fastest growing multi-site churches. She is passionate about helping local churches thrive and equipping leaders to fulfill their calling. She's the author of the book, Developing Female Leaders, which we discuss in this conversation. So before we jump in, let me tell you that today's show is brought to you by Audible. The way this works is that Audible offers you, as a podcast listener, a free audiobook with a 30-day trial membership. So if you decide to use our link to get a trial membership, that helps to support the podcast. We really appreciate the support. It helps to cover our costs and keep the podcast going so that we can provide this content for you. And you can get Developing Female Leaders as an Audible book. So I would encourage you, after you listen to this conversation, head over to estherlittlefield.com/audible and choose Developing Female Leaders by Kadi Cole to be your first Audible Listen. If you decide that it's not for you and you don't want to keep going with Audible, you can cancel at any time, but you still get to keep the titles that you've already downloaded. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into our conversation with Kadi Cole. Hi, friend. I'm Esther, and today I'm here with my co-host, Holly, and our guest, Kadi Cole. Kadi, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you guys so much. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Yes, we're excited to chat with you, and we'd love for you to just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you're currently leading.
Well, yeah, I have been in ministry for about 20 years full time, but now I actually lead my own leadership development company. I work with a lot of businesses and churches, helping them work on their leadership development strategies, build their organization, sort of move their business forward through people.
That's awesome. And where do you live? Tell us a little bit about you and your family and where you live.
Yeah, I've been married 22 years to my husband, Matt. We met at church when we were youngins. We have a 15-year-old son who just crushed his first year of high school. So we're all very relieved and celebrating that right now. And I'm the one really mostly celebrating and relieved. And we live in South Florida in West Palm Beach, which is on the East Coast, just a little north of Fort Lauderdale, Miami area.
Love it.
Yeah. Another Florida girl.
I know. Which is summer now. And so really it's the time we all go indoors, which is the opposite of how I grew up, which is where summer hits and everybody goes outdoors. But now we live in the air conditioning.
Yeah, exactly. So we love to talk about people's leadership journeys. So I would love for you to tell us a little bit about what your leadership journey has looked like.
Well, I don't know if this is a unique one. It feels unique and eclectic to me. You know, when you look back, kind of how God develops you and grows you and gives you opportunities. I was really growing up kind of a lazy kid. I sort of sat around. I watched a ton of television. I drank a lot of Diet Coke. I ate horribly. Like I did stuff at school and I was kind of in sports, but I wasn't really good at any of it and I wasn't driven to anything. But when I went into high school, so between my middle school years and high school years, first of all, I think spiritually, God really got a hold of my heart. I was not very kind in middle school. I was, kind of that classic nasty, insecure girl. And so I sort of went into high school without any friends and just realizing that my life was really not doing anything great. And so I was at summer camp and really kind of fully surrendered my life to the Lord. I'd grown up in church and felt like I was saved, but just really decided to try living God's way. And so that just opened up a whole new world for me. And I feel like in high school, then I really found my leadership legs because I got involved in things. When you don't have friends and you don't want to eat alone in the lunchroom, you join clubs, which is what I did. I had someplace to go every day for lunch. And so, but it was such a great opportunity for me because my high school, we were in Montana, and so there wasn't a ton of people. It wasn't overrun. So there was always room for me to do something or to be on a team or to offer something. And so that kind of variety and sort of general opportunity, I just really took advantage of and sort of filled up my days with that. So high school and college, I just had great opportunities in school, in after school clubs, in church life. And that really sort of found my sort of expression of leadership. And then when I went to college, I went to nursing school. And so nursing is a real female-oriented profession that strives a lot on leadership development because we, run hospitals and things like that. Mm-hmm. So there was a lot of formalized leadership development, which I'd never had before. And I just loved it. I loved every book. I loved every professor. There wasn't a lot of it because it was a small percentage. But man, those were the areas that I was like, this is what I love to do. And so I imagined a lot of those things for myself. And out of college, I moved to Florida for a job down here and started getting involved in a church that was very much oriented towards developing leaders and volunteer empowerment. And so again, those were like great opportunities for me to thrive. I got recruited from a woman at the church who was a vice president at a college here in town. And so I started working at a university and ran the health center and counseling center. And again, colleges, especially Christian colleges, very oriented towards leadership development. I worked a lot with students and developing their leadership. Eventually, I got promoted to a dean in student development where I oversaw residential life, many of the student leadership development programs, all the programming on campus, the discipline system. So all those opportunities really sort of just crafted and built into me. Plus, I kind of came of age when leadership was really sort of the buzz in business. So the John Maxwell years, when Jim Collins first came out, and I was going to all the conferences and reading all the stuff, and the internet started, all these things happened that for me just gave me all the right information, plus sort of my gifting and kind of passion and drive to do and help. All of that sort of married together and just gave me a lot of opportunity to serve and to lead.
I love it. I love it. So leadership can be so rewarding, but it can also be challenging. So would you mind sharing maybe one of the biggest challenges that you've experienced during your leadership journey?
Oh, golly. Well, I feel like I have a way bigger list of challenges than probably anything. I would say one of my biggest kind of overall lessons is shifting my mindset from seeing potential in people to actually knowing what's worth investing in. I'm a very hopeful person. I love my faith and the hope that we have in the Lord. I believe the best for things. I know God is all powerful and can do anything. So it was a rough lesson for me to realize that not everyone wants to walk in the ways of God. Not everyone takes advantage of the opportunities he gives you. I think my sort of surrender conversion, like I mentioned, going into high school was so full and so dramatic and so instant. I just assumed everybody, when they started following the Lord, just gave up everything and had no agenda and was fully surrendered and wanted more than anything to just hear God's voice and follow it. And I certainly haven't done all that perfectly, but I've met a lot more people in my leadership that I think still are keeping control of their own life, or don't want to actually do what's right, or don't want to be teachable, or don't obey the Lord, or just all of those things. And so it was a big slap in the face. I spent the first probably 5 to 10 years of my leadership just being very confused why some people were great to lead and some people were horrible to lead, until I kind of really tapped into it's not about their potential or my ability to see potential or even equip and position them to take advantage of potential. It's about their willingness to follow through on the potential given to them. And that's what I measure people's leadership on now. That's what I measure my hiring on now, or whether people stay on my team is, are you taking advantage of your potential? That tells me everything I need to know.
That is so good. I think that we spend so much time pouring into potential in people, and that's great, but it can be very exhausting if they're not cooperative in that process. So I'm so glad that you pointed that out. I think that's great. So on the flip side, I would love to know what has been one of the most rewarding experiences in your leadership.
There's been so many. I think anytime I see and can connect the dots to the effort I put into something with the impact in someone's life, that to me is just so personally rewarding. And I think the longer I've been leading, and now the kind of the bigger my influence or the more people I supervise, in some ways it's sort of disheartening because you're less connected to those frontline stories. It kind of filters through more people when it actually impacts someone. But at the same time, I can start to see more of these bigger shifts. So for example, like one of those bigger shifts is I spent several years at my church, which after I went to the university, I worked in my church for 16 years and kind of grew in leadership with the church and was eventually executive director over all the campuses. And I ran our leadership program. And so that leadership school that I started really was very personal to me. It was a lot of combination of my own education and experiences. The things that I felt like weren't developed in me early enough were really part of the curriculum of that. So it was a very personal project, but it reached a lot of people. And so I still get stories back or see people who have graduated from the program and know that my efforts in that have really touched a lot of people who are now touching a lot of people. So that's super rewarding from sort of an organizational standpoint. But then like with the book coming out, one of the most surprising pieces for me that I didn't really see coming was just emails off my website or people sending me a message on Instagram that just say, hey, I read this part of your book, or my pastor or boss read your book, and it resulted in I just got a raise. I just got a title promotion. I just finally got acknowledged for what I've been doing. And that has been, I've forgotten how amazing that is when it's so directly related to one person's actual experience. So those are, that's really the paycheck of leadership, right?
Yeah.
When we see that we made a difference, because hopefully that's our key motivation in it.
Yeah. I love that. It's so amazing. And we've both read the book, so we're definitely going to dive into talking about that. But first, I would love to ask, just tell us a little bit about who has invested in your leadership journey, because mentors and people that invest in us are such a powerful part of our experience. So I'd love to know who that's been for you.
I've had both formal and informal people sort of invest in me. I think probably the most significant have been my formal supervisors. And I love to talk about that because I think a lot of times we talk a lot about these informal opportunities, but there is nothing like a great boss who knows how to develop you and challenge you just enough to stretch you and hold you accountable to high standards. Like that, the power of a great boss is really, I think, under celebrated and under recognized. And also how challenging it is to work for a great boss because they never quite are fun. It's like, it's the thing you look back on and you're like, oh my gosh, I learned so much, but that was so hard and so painful. It's like, I don't know, to me, it's the equivalent of like going to boot camp or going into some big athletic training thing and being an Ironman. I'm like, the training stinks so bad, but you can at least know what the goal is. But with a great boss, you don't always realize what the goal is that God has for you in that experience. So I just, I really want to be a great boss. I want to be someone who challenges and sharpens, and people look back at their time under my leadership and go, oh my gosh, I am such a better person. I'm such a better leader. I know more of myself. I can do more than I ever thought I could because I sat under her leadership. To me, that's the number one goal. Being liked or having a great time or feeling like we're great friends is a far secondary goal. It's a little bit like parenting. We want to be close with our kids, but at the end of the day, we want our kids to be glad we were their parents, not glad we were their best friend. And so keeping that main thing. So those folks, I had a couple great female leaders that early on, I think God just sort of handpicked for me that were challenging, but so good. And for me to see hard, strong, dedicated, accomplished leadership in females. I didn't realize how important that would be later when I worked in very male-dominated environments. And then I had some really great men who mentored me, especially in the ministry world. That's where I mostly worked for guys. Just helping me understand ministry, helping me understand strategy, helping me understand the big picture, how to balance hard left brain leadership with more soft right brain pastoring. That combination is not always easy to kind of thread that needle. And so I just had some really great examples of that they did that for me. And then they also helped me learn how to do that for others.
That's amazing. It's so powerful. And I love that you pointed out that really as a leader, as a boss, whatever your role is, that the primary goal is to help your team reach their goals and move them forward and not just be their best friend. And I think that's a trap sometimes we fall into, trying to just be friends with all of our team members. And that's not necessarily going to bring the results that we need. So,
right. It gets confusing because I think for me, I feel like the goal of leadership is to make people better through the act of work. It's not just to accomplish the work. The main goal is to make people better, but we do that through the art of work. And so those two things are inextricably linked to me.
Yeah. So you have recently written and published the book, Developing Female Leaders, and Holly and I have both read it and just love it. And so we would love to talk a little bit about that. And I'd love to know why you decided to write this book in the first place.
Well, it's kind of an interesting story, mostly because I have been a female in leadership, especially in church spaces for a long time, but I've never really been someone that kind of waved the female leader banner. It wasn't like a hill I wanted to die on. It wasn't something that I had a lot of clarity for in my own life. I really just wanted to serve my church, whatever role God had me in at the time and do my best and bring all my giftedness to that. And for me, I was in a variety of different theological environments, a variety of different cultures, different areas of the country. I always just seemed to find a way to find a spot for myself. And it's partly God opening it. It's also partly me being open to what was available and just learning to thrive in those spaces that fit me and not feeling pressure to conform to something, but finding my own way in a way that was very authentic and a way that I felt called to serve. But as I've grown in leadership, and especially now that I do my own company, I'm less in sort of the day-to-day of one church, and I work with a lot of church leaders. I travel a lot. I speak at a lot of conferences and networking events. And I had a series of experiences, 3 experiences, where I had male senior and executive pastors sort of come up to me and ask for my advice on how to help the female leaders on their team. And the first time it happened, I was like, oh my gosh, I've been in ministry almost 20 years. I have never had that happen before. And so I just thought this was so amazing that this one, set of leaders at this one church was so proactive and aware and realizing that there were some things in their culture and things in their leadership practice that was actually keeping women from bringing their best contribution, and they wanted to undo that. And they were humble enough to admit that they didn't always know what that was. And so they wanted some help on it. And that first conversation was such an eye-opener to me. It was so encouraging. I was like, these are the good guys. I'm so excited. There are some of these guys out there who are actually talking about it. I think a lot of great leaders, men and women, but particularly men in the church, are thinking this, but not a lot of them have brought it to their leadership table. And as a team are saying, we need to do something different, and going outside to actually invite someone like me into that conversation. And so I was just really impressed with them. And so as we talked, they shared many of the things they were doing, which were great. There were some things that they were doing which weren't that great, ways they were phrasing things, opportunities they were giving women that they were proud of. But for me, I was like, I'm not sure that's a good idea. And eventually I got to meet some of the women on their team and do some coaching with them. And sure enough, they actually were not interpreting those efforts as positive. They were taking them as signs that their leadership was not valued there. There was probably not a future for them if they wanted to keep growing. They felt that there was a big lid on their potential. And these guys felt just the opposite. And so that kind of space between what these great guy leaders were trying to do for women leaders and what these women leaders were longing to hear from their male supervisors, they were missing each other, even though they were actually after the same thing. And so that conversation was an eye-opener. And then it happened almost identically 2 more times over the course of about 3 months. And when God does something weird 3 times in a row, you're kind of, the first time you're like, cool. The second time, like, that's strange. And the third time you're like, okay, I guess I should pay attention to this. There's something here for me to do or learn. And so that was really the genesis of the book, is really my heart, because I work mostly with male leadership teams. I work with leadership teams who happen to, in today's day and age, mostly are men. And there are so many of them who are actually trying to do a better job at this at varying levels of intentionality and success. But I just thought, gosh, this is such an important topic. And I probably do have something to share that can translate easily, because I live in these spaces with these guys and other topics about multi-site or growth or leadership pipelines. Because I'm already in conversation with them, maybe I can bring some awareness and some movement to this conversation that I see sort of percolating in the church. And all this sort of happened before the Me Too movement broke and the Church Too movement. And so I really look at it now and I'm just like, oh my goodness, God's timing and just sort of helping me be sort of in advance of all of the ugliness of it. But now, especially after the last year, which is so heartbreaking for many of us, all of us, but for many of us who have been watching and following these leaders in particular this last year, it's been so heartbreaking. And so I feel so fortunate and honored to sort of have some actionable next steps. And I feel like people are now not only interested in doing a better job, they feel the urgency to fix the things that are wrong in their culture. And I just so appreciate that combination of good-hearted vision with the urgency that God is sort of brewing in the church. It says, you've had time to work on it proactively. And so now I'm going to actually raise the topic of the urgency to get everybody's attention to really look at how we're doing it. Are we actually living out whatever our beliefs are we actually living out our full beliefs? Because that was one of the things in the research of the book is it doesn't really matter where you land theologically. We all kind of stink at carrying out our actual value of women, whatever that looks like. None of us are doing a great job fully living up to what we believe women can contribute in the kingdom.
That answer is so great. I think that I love God's timing and the fact that he allowed this book to land when it landed, and in everything that you were talking about with the different movements and the stirring and stuff, because this is, like you said, a really great proactive way to move forward once you sense that there may be something that God is leading you to change. So I just love that. So I would love you to talk about, and I think that we know a lot of the things that you might answer this with, but I would love to hear your perspective. What are some of the main challenges that female leaders face when they're serving in churches today? I think a lot of our listeners are sort of in that sort of demographic, and would love to hear your take on that.
Well, there's kind of two main buckets that I like to talk about this in. In the book, I sort of talk through, again, it's written really for leaders to do a better job in their culture. So there's 8 best practices. But I think from a female leader perspective, there's 2 main things that we're always sort of challenged with. One is the glass ceiling. In the church world, we call it the stained glass ceiling. But it's, those things in the system or the organization or the culture or the mindsets of people that we're going to bump up against that really aren't in our control, other than to maybe advocate or be aware and bring voice to them. But they aren't in our control to change necessarily, because they are things that we're not in charge of. And so things like equal titles, equal pay for equal work, and mindsets that we run into about what women can and cannot do or shouldn't do. And again, when it comes to our theological views, we all have very different viewpoints that, this is a gray issue scripturally. I take a position personally, and I try to be very clear about this in the book, that I have had amazing experiences in sort of every level of theology of this, sort of across the spectrum. I make a case that I think there's more than just 2 ways to look at this. I don't think this is a binary decision. I feel like there's actually 7 different stops along the spectrum of theology of this, depending on your belief system and how that plays out in your culture. And so I really support and want to honor everybody's viewpoint. But even within those viewpoints, like I mentioned earlier, there are some limitations and some biases that come into play that, let's just say, even in our very conservative worlds where we say women really should be mostly working with other women and kids, that's probably the most conservative viewpoint. Even there, we have things like women's ministry is generally underfunded compared to many other ministries of the church. It tends to be underled from the leadership team. It has little attention paid to it. I think part of that is we're often under accountable to our results. And so women's ministry oftentimes becomes sort of a church within a church, because it doesn't have the accountability that some of our other ministries have. Mostly because people aren't paying enough attention to it. It's not integrated well into the body. It's missing key leadership. A lot of times it's the mindset of the population they're serving is minimized compared to the number of women in the congregation, and how we would actually be reaching for things outside, maybe morning Bible study for women who work, women with kids. We tend to not take on the reality of women's ministry, which deals a lot with childcare. And so we just aren't funding it or leading it the same. Same with children's ministry. We oftentimes don't educate our children's leaders the same way we would educate a student pastor or someone who's teaching adult classes. We don't send them to seminary. We don't take them to conferences. Again, we don't fund them the same. Many times our children's leaders, whether they're a director or a pastor or just a volunteer person, they are oftentimes touching more families than any other ministry in the church, and they don't have the same staffing to really shepherd and pastorally care for all of them. They generally ministry in most churches have more volunteers than any other leadership team or ministry. They don't have the same resources. So they're just underfunded, underled. So those are some of the glass ceilings. Even in very conservative environments, we aren't prioritizing those ministries. And many times they're the heartbeat of the church. Usually children's ministry and engagement of women are two key performance drivers in the growth and effectiveness of a ministry in a community. And then we tend to give them the least amount of resources and the least high level leadership and the least voice at the table. So those sorts of things tend to happen in sort of the glass ceiling spaces. I think the more interesting thing, though, for women leaders is what is known as the sticky floor. So there are things that limit our growth and leadership potential above us, but below us, our feet sometimes get in this analogy, get stuck to the floor and we hold ourselves back. And these are those mindsets and even biases against women or against ourselves that we hold, statements that have been told to us, assumptions we've made about us, things we've absorbed from our experiences growing up, our family of origin, the church we grew up in, the theology we grew up in, the community, the culture, the place of the place in the country we grew up with. There's just all these messages, especially if you're a little older like me, you guys are younger, but many of us who grew up in like the 70s and 80s, our entire culture was very gender-based and had a lot of gender biases. So like in the 70s and 80s, it wasn't even possible for a woman to have her own credit card without her dad or her husband co-signing for her. She couldn't buy her own home or her own car. And so, those kinds of things are the culture I grew up in that had nothing to do with the theology I grew up under, but the culture was so thick about those kind of subtle, and they felt unspoken messages to women that I carry that into my leadership. There are things that I'm doing and spaces I'm working in and, money I'm making that the whole time I'm wondering, is it really okay that I'm making this? Should I really be charging this? Should I really be on this kind of a platform? Is it okay? Will people listen to me if I talk about this subject? And not even like this controversial subject, but I mean like how to manage your calendar, like things I'm really, really good at that have nothing to do with gender, how to use a great admin assistant. These are topics that I talk about or teach about that have nothing to do with gender, but I myself go into them going, oh, I think everybody already knows all this. Oh, I don't think I have anything to teach them. And those are really my own sticky floor issues that only get exacerbated in ministry, where we have these kind of theological pressures that we've grown up with or that we're leading in. And we're wondering, can I actually close in prayer? I tell oftentimes a story of like someone who leads the greeter team, who is a strong woman and has been leading for a long time and has been following the Lord for the long time and has done, every women's Bible study. She's a solid believer. She knows and loves her church. She carries their DNA. She's been equipped and empowered to lead this greeter team on Sunday morning. And a brand new guy to the church, who just went through the membership class and just got signed up to serve, is on her team now. And she wonders, should I let him close in prayer because he's a man? Like, is that the right thing to do? He might not even be a believer yet or be a brand new Christian. And she asks herself, is that the more spiritually appropriate thing? Right. And I'm like, no matter what environment you're in, I can almost guarantee you her senior pastor would die at the fact that she's questioning that. But we question that all the time. And so we spend a lot of sideways energy not having good clarity about how our beliefs really play out in our ministry environments, and particularly that sticky floor that happens inside us. I think most men who are leading us would be shocked to know how much time and energy we are devoting questioning if we should, if we shouldn't, and then doing it and wondering if we're going to get caught and wondering if we're going to get in trouble. It's kind of like, I'm like driving to car line with my son and we're a little late and I go by a cop and I'm like, oh, are they going to pull me over? It feels like that, right? It's like I closed in prayer. Is that okay? Is someone going to tell me? Am I going to get called in? Am I going to get fired from my volunteer role? And we just spend a lot of anxiety and energy questioning ourselves because we don't have good clarity around us, but we also question that clarity internally like 100 times over.
Oh, that is so validating just to hear you say all of those things, because I think as a woman in leadership, I encounter some of that stuff, but I don't know how to put a name to it. And I don't know if other people are experiencing some of the same things. And so just to hear you say some of that is so validating that I think a lot of our listeners are going to be like, yes, thank you so much for saying it and articulating it so well. So Thank you very much.
Can I add one more thing to that?
Yeah,
I think
please.
one of the other things that's important to know about the sticky floor that I'm trying to communicate more and more to people now as I've started to realize it in my own leadership and in other leadership experiences is that most of these good guys, these leaders, they actually have done a pretty good job empowering us. And our sticky floor is making us very needy for re-clarification and reaffirmation. And I'll tell you, if you've ever led someone who's needy and insecure, it is exhausting.
Yeah.
And so I think as female leaders, one of our biggest responsibilities is to have clarity on what the actual issue is that we're battling. Because I think a lot of women have sticky floor issues and they're claiming glass ceiling issues. And so their leaders are like, I thought I made this clear. I hired you. I gave you a job description. I announced you in staff meeting. I've given you a budget and I've told you to run. Why do you keep coming back to me asking if you should be doing something? Like the whole reason I hired you was to go and lead. And so we have to own our own sticky floor issues and not like annoy our leaders to death. Now, if we need clarity, we need to get clarity. So I'm 100%. But if you've been given clarity, if they have verbally and confirmed in writing what it is they want you to do, then we need to get support in other ways than from our leader needing to constantly reaffirm what they've already affirmed in us. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And so important to hear.
Yeah, that holds us back from progressing because it makes it look like we're insecure. And we are, but not in the ways that they're assuming. Right? We're actually insecure about our own insecurity. So we need to get girlfriends. We need to get other fellow leaders. We need to listen to podcasts like this. We need to read books. Like we need to fill our confidence factor in ways that are not from just our leader.
Yeah. So important. Oh my gosh. I just want to like scream amen like half the time you're talking. So
I'm do a little really, celebration dance.
I'm really holding back.
The truth sets us free.
So I'm wondering, I'm so interested on your take on this. How have you seen male leadership's view of women as leaders change over the past 20-ish years?
I definitely think we're in the midst of a culture shift. I think we've got a few things at play for that. Not everybody's shifting, but I think the early adopters have already started. And we've got sort of the next level of adopters are kind of coming forward. You know, those, because, you know, all of us, even as leaders, we have some things we're quick to act on and other things we're slower to act on. Yeah. I think there are still some slow people, but I see a lot of people in the front end of this conversation now. And part of it is being motivated by just our day and age. I think the biggest movement we're seeing is because we have a lot of boomer and Gen X male leaders who have wives that are more educated and more gifted and more seasoned and are ready to lead in their church. And they're kind of looking at their husband saying, what in the world? Like, am I not going to get to, or do I not get to? I think that area gets a little confusing because now you've got this pastor's wife role and female leader role, which isn't always synonymous. And so that has a layer of confusion to it that I think we're going to have to kind of navigate together. I think the more exciting piece for female leaders in particular is their daughters coming of age. And so they have teenage and young adult women that they have raised to be leaders in their home, because this was a generation of men who grew daughters to have a voice and sat at the dinner table with them, and they put them in children's ministry leadership programs, and they've been running summer camp for the last 6 years, and they've been serving in their church fully empowered as a 16, 17, 18-year-old young leader. They go to college, they come back, and now at 19, 20, 25, 30, they're supposed to go and bake casseroles or only serve in children's ministry. And their daughters are looking at their dads going, you know, what in the world? Like, what the heck, Dad? Like, I used to run that program and now I have to work in the kitchen for it. Like, that doesn't make sense. And their dads are like, you're right. And they see this great female leader that they have personally groomed, and they want to release them into ministry leadership. And so again, it doesn't really matter your theology. It's about your mentality of how can I really release the gifts of the women God has brought to my congregation. And many of those daughters especially are leaving their dad's church, and that kills them. And so the openness and the motivation, because, whenever something becomes personal to a leader, their passion goes through the roof. So if, any of us, this happens, like if we've gone through a tough marriage time, all of a sudden marriage ministry becomes super important to us. If we have a child with special needs and the autism walk and, advocating for healthcare, those things become much more important to us. So when these guys are having their daughters struggle finding their place in a church and really answering the call that they see God has on their life, man, it becomes personal. And they're not just fighting for a theological belief anymore. They're fighting for their daughter and their granddaughters and their wives, and they want to make space for them. And they're willing to go into some awkward, hard conversations about what they believe versus what they've inherited. And, Beth Moore has been doing an amazing job the last month or so, really for the last several months, but particularly the last month, really putting out there some content that's just saying, hey, I have a certain set of beliefs, but the misogyny that has been bridled under this theology is no longer acceptable to me. And I think there are a lot of men leaders who are questioning themselves, going like, am I making that decision because it's what God's word says? Or am I making that decision because that's what I was taught to think or taught to believe? And now these women are actually challenging that cultural belief, not my biblical belief, but that cultural belief. And so how can I redraw this line that isn't letting go of my biblical standards, but is adapting to the fact that 50 or 100 years ago, when someone made this practice, no women, graduated from high school. Most of them couldn't read. So there were certain rules that you wouldn't let anyone who was uneducated not do certain things of leadership. But now our women are at a totally different place, and I need to rethink how my theology plays out in today's culture, given the new reality.
Yeah. So much good stuff there. And I love what you did in the book. You really took this approach of talking about the different theological differences that are out there. And like you've said so far in our conversation, that it doesn't matter where you land on that, but you can still include women in the leadership of your church in whatever way that falls in your theology. So one of the questions I have for you, though, is I think if you're a leader of a church or you're a pastor listening, go buy the book and read it to find out what you need to be doing as a church leader. But I'm thinking about the women who are listening, who are maybe in a church role or in a ministry volunteer setting, and they're not really sure where their church lands. And you talk about the need for churches to get clarity on that. But what would you say to the woman who's in that setting who isn't sure where her church leadership lands on the theological spectrum? Or if she's in a position where maybe she disagrees with that stance, what would you give for recommendations for her?
That is a great question. So the first question of how do I figure that out? I actually have a download that you can do off my website. It's a theological cheat sheet, and it really articulates in a much clearer way than I was able to do in the printed book. It's kind of a graph, which makes it really easy to sort of see the different viewpoints of theology. And I really encourage everyone to spend time on that before you start dialoguing about it, because it's helpful in giving you some language. It helps you sort of line up maybe what you've been told about certain beliefs and kind of see how it actually plays out, and just makes it a little less emotional when you spend a little time reflecting on it, particularly for women, because this is a personal subject. It's oftentimes very charged. We come in with a lot of strong viewpoints and things that we feel passionate about. Could be any direction, but we're going to feel passionate about it. And so using a tool like the theological cheat sheet really kind of helps you articulate and think and process through the emotions of it, so that when you go to your church leaders to ask some questions, you're not coming sort of like with all this emotion as the leader. You can really come with some logic, some curiosity. You've worked through sort of your own walk with the Lord on it. You can trust him in whatever answer you're going to get. You need to be okay with whatever's going to happen. Like with anything you're advocating, whatever leadership you're wanting to get your leaders' attention or to make change with, you have to come at it with a combination of real honest advocacy and real authentic humility. So those two pieces is how a leader makes movement in their organization or in their environment. So we have to make sure we do our own work to go forward with it. But I would say for a woman who doesn't know, spending a little time so you've got some language and some ways to ask intelligent questions and get clarity. But then go to your leaders, whoever that leader is. If it's, if you lead a small group, go to your small group coach. If it's, if you're in women's ministry, go to the discipleship guy. If you know the senior pastor, ask him, and just very honestly and very kindly and patiently say, hey, what is our view on this? And I can almost guarantee you that if you're confused, it's because they don't have a really succinct answer. So give a little grace to the fact that you probably have been caught them a little off guard, or they're a little unsure how to answer and what your agenda is. It's a guarded, awkward topic. And so we have to make space for one another as brothers and sisters to go into hard topics with some grace and patience and love for one another to get to a place of common understanding. We don't have to get to a place of agreement, but we do have to get to a place where we understand what our leaders believe. And then we can take that and decide what we believe and what that means for us and where God's calling us. So that would be the first way. Answer is to approach your leaders and ask the question and give grace and time and openness that it might take a few conversations, or it might take even more for them to even be able to articulate it in a way that they can feel proud of. The second question is, what do you do if you find that you're in an environment where you maybe don't agree? And I would say I've met more and more women who are on all sides of this topic. There are obviously the easy one is that I'm a woman who feels like I can do more than my church thinks I can do. But there are also a lot of women who are in environments that are being more progressive on this topic and are changing their view of women in theology. And they're having a hard time navigating the shift to a more progressive viewpoint. And so I would say in either of those cases, you want to make sure that you do your own work with the Lord. At the end of the day, we are all in charge of stewarding our own gifts and our own understanding of God's word. We have great leaders in place. God trains and raises up leaders to help us. But at the end of the day, we are each going to stand before the Lord and give an account for our own individual life. This is sort of why Jesus came, why the veil was torn, is that no priest, no pastor, no husband is going to stand and give an account for my life. I am going to give an account before the Lord for my life. And so at the end of the day, I need to make sure I know in my own heart, with just my own walk with the Lord, what He says for me and for my life. And again, this is a great issue, and I can give you a list of really well-respected, godly leaders on all sides of the theological issue. So I don't have a way to be able to guarantee that you're right and someone else is wrong, because there's just too many people I love and trust and respect their walk with the Lord and their understanding of theology who really disagree about this issue. So you just kind of have to land on it for yourself and even give yourself freedom to change over time. I know a lot of people who have changed their viewpoint over time. So it might even be something that is a continual search for you. Give yourself freedom to have that. It is unclear in scripture, and you're going to be hard pressed to find someone who can really 100% defend their viewpoint without anyone having an argument against them. So knowing what that is, and then having a really good viewpoint of where your church is, and there's two parts to the church space. One is, what do they actually believe theologically? And I even say on that theological cheat sheet, give that a circle and label it your church beliefs. But then where is the culture at practically? So let's just say you actually are in a very egalitarian environment. Your church fully believes in fully empowering women, maybe even all the way up to preaching on the weekends or even being a lead pastor, all the way. But the culture in which you live in and in which your church is at, there are no women in leadership. There are no women pastors on staff. Women do not have equal titles. They oftentimes don't have equal pay. And you feel the culture saying no to you in a lot of ways, or you know that you shouldn't ask for things in a lot of ways. So if you feel like you have gifts that are not getting utilized, you really are at a crossroads, right? Because you don't actually disagree with your church theologically. You disagree with the way the culture is. I think this is actually where we have the most opportunity as women leaders to make strides. If we can say and connect with the Lord long enough to go, I know I am called here. And I'm not just called here to be me. I'm actually called here to help shift, change, and shift culture. If you disagree with the theology of your leader, then you actually do need to leave the church, because unless you can just kind of set that aside and say, I choose to fall under the leadership of my leaders and lead within the boundaries that they've given me. And I can 100% feel confident advocating that, defending it, speaking for that. There are a lot of theological issues that I have led even on staff where I actually disagree with our practical policy on things that are of debate, things about drinking, things about who leads, things about the way we handle our money, things about who we put our staff dollars to, things about where the vision is going. But as a leader, I know that those aren't black and white major issues in the kingdom, and I am more than happy to submit my personal viewpoint and my personal preference for the sake of the kingdom and because I know I'm called here. And so my job as a leader is to affirm and support my leaders in their viewpoint of theology and vision, and I will champion that to the death. Even though if I had my druthers, I'd change it, a lot of it. But that's what you sign up for as a leader, right? That's
Right.
what we do. So that might be one of these topics for you. However, if you are in an environment where you agree theologically, but you disagree with the culture, I would just encourage you, this is the place that I feel like God is calling up women to not lead the church, but to lead change. And that is a really different agenda. When I look at the story, like one of my favorite stories about this is the story of Esther, which I feel like we all kind of look at and we're like, she became queen and she's, got rid of her sticky floor and lived into her calling, blah, blah, blah. There is only an Esther because there was a Queen Vashti who actually took the hit to change culture.
Mhm.
And I feel like in many cases, that has been one of my calling is to be the misfit on the team, the first one to dive into something, to be the one who's like not really thinking I'm championing women, but passively, unknowingly just showing up. I'm actually creating culture change. I remember particularly in my last role, which was a very big job and very stressful and was a first on sort of this higher level leadership team. And my bosses were very supportive of me, but the culture was not yet there. And so it was a constant sense of questioning. I had my own sticky floor issues I was over. So I'm like, am I doing something wrong? Am I just insecure? Is the culture why am I in turmoil? Like it just felt like it was just, and so it felt like that a lot. But I just remember God reminding me, like I would stand in staff meeting. I would always make myself sit in the front because that's where leaders sit, even though I'd prefer to be in the back. I'm like, I need to just walk into the opportunities my leaders and the Lord have given me. Even if I don't feel like I belong, even if I feel like an imposter and a fraud, I'm going to step into it because that's what God has given me. And it matters that I keep showing up. Like it matters that I show up. It matters that I didn't get fired. It matters that I didn't quit because I am creating change, and creating change is hard work. It's the harder work of leadership than just being a leader. Having the position is the easy part. Creating change, leading from the middle, doing things that aren't your direct responsibility or authority, that is where real leadership comes into play. And that's what many of us have the opportunity to do right now. If we're willing to do the real work of servant leadership and not get all cranky about the stuff that comes later. And I'm telling you, the women who come later, they'll get the title, they'll get the job, they'll get the pay, they'll get the maternity leave, they're going to get all these things, the sabbatical, all these things you didn't get. But you are the one who paved, you were the Vashti who paid away. Vashti lost her queenship because she stood up for what was right for women. And Esther made the difference. But Esther saved a nation because of what Queen Vashti did on her behalf. So many of us are going to be called into those environments. And to be honest, I feel like this is where the rubber meets the road. Do you just want to be a female leader, or do you actually want to go and lead? Because if you're going to shy away from it, that's fine. But please don't feel like you're championing the cause of leadership for women if you want the easy route of leadership. Like we are in the crucible of actually making a dent. This is where real leaders step up, step into the gap, go first, be the misfit, take the hits, and do it with godliness and integrity and humility. That's real leadership, not the role or the position or the benefits or the platform. I get a little fired up about this.
So this might become a 3-hour podcast.
That was fantastic. I loved that. And I just love your common sense approach to these things. So I guess the next sort of question I have is, the truths of the Bible don't change, but having women in leadership roles seems to be sort of a new and growing concept. So I'm wondering why you think this is more of a recent development and a recent sort of cultural shift.
Well, I think this is a hard analogy, so I want to preface this or like comparison, because a lot of people sort of link gender rights to like ethnic rights and the black and white racial divide. I don't feel like as a woman, a white woman in America in the church, I have any real comparison to what my African American brothers and sisters have gone through. So I don't compare it. I don't think it's the same. I certainly have not faced, even though I've had resistance to myself and my leadership, and women have for decades, in most cases, it's not anywhere the same. So that's my preface. However, when you look at how culture and society has shifted over time, when you look at the kind of racial rights in our culture, there was a time where Black people were not even allowed to sit in a church with white people, let alone be in roles of leadership or have a voice or make a statement on behalf of God to a people, right? That has shifted over time because our culture has shifted over time. But it was led by the church. The church made way because we are the ones who value people for who they are, not for the circumstances around them. In fact, we're the ones who say every person is made on purpose, handcrafted by God, with their skin color and their nationality and the place and time in history they were born and the parents they had and their giftedness and their wiring and the circumstances and every experience they've ever had, good or bad or hard or easy. Like, we know God is sovereign over all of those, and he does all of those things on purpose for every person, every person. And so even though culture shifts and the church practices catch up, when you go back and look at all of these movements, they almost always start with godly people stepping up and speaking out against cultural norms that are harmful to particularly a minority or an oppressed group of people. And so just like our culture has shifted with the racial reconciliation, now, obviously, we're not even done with this. It's still tense. It's still not good, but it's not about our beliefs being wrong. Again, it's kind of like our cultural theology isn't wrong, but our practices are still wrong. We haven't matched up. We don't have integrity between what we believe and how we behave. And so that needs to line up. I think this issue is exactly the same thing because the race issues of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, women's rights were right on the heels, almost in step with that, but just a little behind. And so in terms of time, so the race kind of led with Martin Luther King kind of led first, and then women's rights kind of came just right on the heels of it. And so we as a church, again, when all of a sudden we have, just like we've seen African Americans and all sorts of different nationalities rise up in education, in finance, in professionalism, in leadership ability, they finally have education and opportunity the way that white people have. We're like, oh, so it's not just about black and white. It's about educated and non-educated. It's not just about white versus whatever. It's about leadership gifting, right? And so that's what we're seeing with men and women is that women are all of a sudden, at least the majority of us have been able to get education and have been able to be in leadership training since 7th grade and have been able to have opportunities to be an RA at their college. And so all of a sudden, it's not like, oh, leadership isn't based just on gender. It's based on gifting, right? And so not every woman should be a leader. I always say my book is not a women's development book. It's a female leadership book. It's really for women who have giftings, ability, and callings to lead. There are a whole bunch of women who should never be in leadership positions, just like there are a whole bunch of men who should never be in leadership positions. Those are great. I love that, but that's not who I'm writing to. And I really want to encourage, especially male leaders, just because you have a woman who wants a leadership position does not mean you should put her in that role. Like just being female doesn't automatically qualify you to lead. Yeah. Even though our culture would say that is, right? Our culture says women know better. Women are better leaders. If you're a mom, you should be running the world. I'm like, I know a bunch of terrible moms. Please don't put them in charge of anything, let alone the world or the Department of Defense. Like they should not be doing that. And so, my thing is always like I don't want the future to be female. I want the future to be together. That's what Jesus teaches us in John 17. That is his last prayer for us, is that we would lead together. That is how people will know that he loves them and came to earth to save them, is that we are united and in ministry and doing the work of the kingdom together. All of our gifts, all of our genders, all nations, tribes, tongues, language, all of us together. It's the unity that stands out. And that's where I think we as church leaders, particularly, we have to get on the front end of this. And instead of being the most segregated in a variety of ways place on Sunday, we need to be the most integrated, because that is actually how people will stand up and know that Jesus loves them, is if we work together. And so I think this gender issue to me is a gateway issue, because I think if we can't even do this with the people we are married to and have raised in our homes and make up more than half of our congregations who are like us in every way except gender, we're the same experiences, we have the same accent, we have the same socioeconomic level, we watch the same TV shows. Like if we have all these things the same except male, females, and we can't figure this out, we live with each other and we can't figure this out. How are we ever going to cross divides of economics, of race, of nationality? We are quickly becoming a global society. We can't even get it right with fellow Americans. How are we going to reach into people who are actually Africans, people from Latin America who don't have an American mindset, who don't have a Western mind? We have got to get better at learning how to connect with people different than us. Enough affinity, enough DNA, enough people who get it. Let's find the people who see it differently and expand our view of God and really see what we can do when we connect with people who are different, and God is still the one commonality. That's the place we need to be leading. And I think if we can get this issue right, it's not about, as much to me, getting women in leadership. I think that's helpful. I think it's more about, as leaders, getting better about working with people of diversity and learning those skill sets so that we can actually be the answer to Jesus's prayer in John 17. That's the real call that we have on our lives right now.
We're just going to church today. Okay, so I would love to ask you, a lot of our listeners are strong women. They're leaders. They have strong leadership abilities, but maybe they might be serving in a place where they're under a leader who is insecure. And you mentioned this issue of insecurity earlier that some of us as women struggle with, but sometimes there are leaders who struggle with insecurity, and that person might be intimidated by this woman in a role underneath them. So what would you say to that woman? How should she handle that kind of situation if she's in a role where, whether it's male or female over her, that they are perhaps intimidated due to insecurity?
I think this is an area I've had to grow in, of how to follow a leader who's insecure or maybe less gifted or maybe less skilled or less experienced. The older I get, the more I'm realizing, oh my gosh, it's really actually hard for me to follow someone who's got more experience than me, because that makes them, like old. And so I have to get better at knowing where my calling is and being confident and secure in the job that God has called me to do, sort of regardless of the circumstances around me on all 360 degrees. So this is really where those principles of leading up come in. And I think one of the mistakes that I made, particularly in sort of male populated environments. I used to call it male dominated, but really I'm trying to be nicer to men who aren't really dominating. They're just more populated. So male populated environments is when I sensed insecurity in a leader, which is pretty easy to sense, it doesn't take long, I would shrink down to be below their level of confidence so that I didn't ruffle anything. But what that did is it really made me lead very small. And I actually remember leaving all sorts of abilities sort of to the side. I can think of one in particular where I had to work with someone who was sort of over like finance and budget, but my presence was a bother and an irritant. And our dynamic wasn't great for a long time. We worked through it, but it was very, very tough. And so my approach was to just back way down and way back. And I remember watching myself in a meeting talk about how I just don't understand budgets and you're the expert and you tell me. Well, the reality is I had managed $1 million budgets. I had negotiated six-figure contracts in my previous job. I always come in under budget. I always know what my budget is. I always am on top of the money. And I positioned and articulated myself as if I was some bimbo airhead girl who had never balanced a checkbook. And I'm like, I run my entire family's finance since I was 16. Like, I know what I'm doing. And I just watched myself, and I remember it was unconscious at first. And then when I realized it, I was like, I am making a conscious choice to be someone I'm not. And it took me years to process that because I didn't know any other way to survive this leadership dynamic than to do that. I think now I'm older and wiser and more confident, and not confident in the sense of like, I feel better about myself, but confident in the sense of I don't have anything to prove one way or another. I don't need to prove that I'm awesome at budgets, and I don't need to prove that I am crappy at budgets. I just need to be me and say the things that I know and let it sit for what it is. And just be, my phrase for this is to be honest and honoring. It's like two sides to the same coin. So I want to be honest about what I know and don't know without needing to prove or show them differently or make my claim to something. So, but I want to be honest about, I know budgets. This is my opinion. This is what I've done in the past. This is how I would approach it. But I want to be honoring in the sense that I don't want to usurp any authority. And it's not my job to help them feel confident about myself, but it's certainly not my job to maximize their insecurity. Out of love, I simply be as respectful and honoring as possible without violating the honesty of what I'm bringing to the table. Does that make sense?
Yes.
It's a difficult balance. And I would say I don't always get it right down the middle, but I'm always trying to have, it's almost like I walk in holding two big anchors. And these are my two anchors. I want to be honest about myself and what I've done without bragging. And I want to be honoring where I'm not usurping or putting anyone down. Because I can be honest about my thing and be like, listen, I've done this for 20 years. This is not the right way to do it. But if he's my authority or he's the expert in the room on this topic, that's not my place. But I can say one way that I've done this in the past, or the way we did this at my last job was that might be worth considering, right? I'm bringing my information. The reason they hired me is because I have experience. So it's my responsibility to bring that experience to the conversation, but it's not my job to make the decision. It's his. So he can take it or leave it, but it's my job to be honest about what I have to offer. But I need to be honoring in the process. First of all, it allows them to hear what I'm actually contributing. But secondly, it's the way I honor God in respecting the person God has put into leadership over me. And so those two things to me is like the balance of how to walk that line.
Those are such practical tips. And sort of as you're talking, I'm like having this realization, like that's exactly sort of my perspective that I had when I was in the work world. But for whatever reason, I had trouble translating that into the ministry world. And my mindset was totally different in both of those places. And so I'm so glad that you said that because it's so interesting as I'm sort of processing that in my head as to why I'm okay, sort of following that perspective, but then on this other like ministry side, I have a hard time. So thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. Okay. So one of our last questions, and this was really my question for you, kind of after I read the book and sort of comparing it with my personal experiences. So I've met lots of women who have very strong views about women not leading in the church or maybe not leading to as full capacity as we've sort of said here as is one of the examples or one of the ends of the spectrums. And most of my opposition that I have faced has been from women. And so I would ask you how you would suggest myself and our listeners tackle this topic with other women who have very different beliefs. Because sort of in my mind, I'm like, okay, we're all sort of maybe not fighting, but we're all sort of championing the same thing. And that's not true. I've come into more opposition from women than I have men.
100%. I think that's my experience also. And it's always feels a little bit like friendly fire, right?
Yeah.
Because you're like, oh, I guess that's a problem there. There's a few things to keep in mind. One is that godly people will defend God's truth, right? And we want them to. I want to be able to defend God's truth. I want you to know God's truth and defend it. We are in a battle, a spiritual battle in our world. And God's word is the only thing we can trust. And that is worth dying for. And so I fully expect every woman who follows the Lord to defend God's word vehemently. The challenge is we disagree on what God's word says about this.
Yeah.
And so a huge piece is to be able to go into this, just like we might disagree about all sorts of theological issues, speaking in tongues, or the role of local church in social justice, or like there's all sorts of things that people have very different theological views about. So if you were to go in and go to a conference about social justice, you would go in sort of listening for the viewpoint of the people so that you could understand and talk with them on a way that was respectful without assuming, right? Because what you're really describing is that we're making an assumption about women, that women are for women, and women are for women, but women are for God's word first.
Yeah.
And so part of what we have to do is when we start tiptoeing into this topic is remember it's debatable and it's awkward and emotional and personal. And so we need to listen and be more curious with one another rather than leading with assumptions. One of the largest populations growing in very conservative complementarian viewpoints are millennials. And so I think sometimes people think old people want women in women's ministry and young people want women in senior pastorals. And that is just really not the truth. So we can never make assumptions. We can't do it based on denomination or even based on race and gender and ethnicity, like all of those things, we can't make assumptions. So we always have to lead with curiosity and openness for people to have their own viewpoint and for us to be able to respect that. The second thing that happens though, is that this is also generational. And so there are women who have gone before us who were told and taught, and it was drilled in, and they have been defending that it is wrong for them to lead. It's wrong for them to have a decision in their home. It's wrong for them to lead in the marketplace. It's wrong for them to not stay home and raise their kids and have any sort of job. It's definitely wrong for them to speak up in church or to have an opinion or to give advice to something. And so when we come forward and we're like, I'm so excited that I'm leading blah, 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 they're going, this is wrong. And even if I can kind of get my head around the fact that what you're doing is right, it causes so much reflection on, have I missed something my whole life? Have I not stewarded my gifts correctly? Was there something I was called to do that I didn't do? And more importantly, these men that I have trusted to lead me my entire life, are they actually not trustworthy? Like, think about that.
Yeah.
It would be like you finding out your parents like have a different personality or a second life or stole all your money your whole life, or, like it's like all of a sudden your whole foundation of the people you've trusted and followed and believed and gave your life to, the whole foundation is shifted. That is a shaky ground. And so I don't blame many women for not wanting to go there. That requires a deep confidence, security, emotional health, and walk with the Lord to even be able to open up that dialogue. Now, I think we're all at different places in the journey, but the friction I see is when someone who's come up with few barriers, but sees it and champions and has gifting that's more activator, and they feel the need to champion something. They're agenda gifted people. Like there are people called to raise an agenda, right? And so that's not me, but I champion those people. That's their calling, is to make big waves and bring awareness. When they interact with someone who has their world shaken and they're not ready to accept that yet, that's the biggest, that's like the extreme conflict. And then all of us have experiences sort of within that spectrum. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So we have a clash of theology and beliefs, and we have a clash of generations and cultural norms and what's right and wrong. And this is just us figuring it out, right? This is all of us finding and in the midst of this somehow is my own calling and my own giftedness. Because if I'm someone who isn't gifted in leadership and I love being at home with my 8 kids and I'm homeschooling and, raising my own chickens and have my own organic farm in the back, which I think that is amazing. That is just as big a calling as someone who's supposed to go out and like plant 100 churches in the world. Like that is just as significant, just as important. That girl is probably not going to feel the need to champion or really even understand someone who wants not to be married and have no kids and wants to be on the road 300 days a year. It's so hard for her to imagine that, right? So it's not only hard to like not support it, it's easy to actually judge it. Just like it's easy for that church planter to judge someone who never got out of the house, right? In quotes, I'm saying.
Yeah.
We have to give part of the maturity of us as women, especially as believers, is we have to have confidence enough in our own calling to give freedom and grace for people to answer their own calling. And that God's word is full of every calling. And let me just say, guys have as much pressure to have a guy calling as women to have a woman calling. And so I feel like we can lead the way for guys to not have to be the main breadwinner, or to not feel like they got to take some left brain 1950s view of leadership in their home to be a godly man. Like, they have just as much pressure. They carry just as much shame. They feel just as much judgment against who they actually are. And we've done just as damaging a job for them. Now, they get paid more for it, so there is some incongruency. But at the end of the day, they're struggling internally just like we are. And all of it is about, we need to be okay and just see God as big as he is, that he has space in the kingdom for all of us. We need to give space in the kingdom for all of us to have a place at the table also.
Yeah.
I love it, Kadi. And we just appreciate all that you've shared with us and the time that you've taken to share this with our listeners. So thank you so much. And I just love ending on that note of just going back to the concept of unity, and that truly that's what we got to come back to, right? Is just being together on this mission to share God's love with others. So what is the best way for people to connect with you? Because I know they're going to want to go and find all your stuff and get that free cheat sheet and all of that. So tell us where to connect with you.
The best place to find sort of my resources is on my website, kadicole.com, and that's spelled KADICOLE.com. And then I'm on all the social media stuff at Kadi Cole, so you can follow some of, we're putting quotes and resources and connections and places I'm speaking, little meetups that we're doing. So definitely follow me on social media, but then join in through the website. And then we actually, for female leaders, we have a Facebook group called Ministry Chick. There's a link on my website. And that is a great place to just network with other female leaders. I'm really trying to take on the research-based stuff in the book. So our two primary goals in that environment is to give great female leader role models, because many of us don't have a lot of great examples to sort of learn from. And then also to create peer networks with women who are leading in similar environments or similar roles, trying to help us find one another, because it does feel lonely and you do feel like you're kind of the only person. And so we're trying to help just build connections that way.
Yeah.
Awesome. And we will have all the links for everything in the show notes so people can click right through to those different resources. So thank you again, Kadi. We really appreciate you being here on the podcast.
Well, thank you both. And thank you for your role in the kingdom and what you're doing with this show and all the other ways that you serve the Lord. So bless you both.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us on the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, would you consider leaving us a rating and review in your podcast app? This helps more women just like you find the podcast. And it also helps them to know whether the podcast would be a good fit for them. Just go to the show in your podcast app, then scroll down until you see the option for ratings and reviews. From there, you can tap to rate and write a review. It means the world to us when you take a couple minutes to do this, and thank you so much to everyone who has left a review. Now, don't forget, your leadership matters, and it's time for you to embrace your gifts and lead with confidence.